Welcome to Learn with Roblox. In today's video, we're going to talk about the distance and midpoint formulas. Let's talk about how to derive the distance formula first. If you have 2 points on a coordinate plane where one point is x1, y1, and the other point is x2, y2, to find this distance between the points, what you can do is simply build a right triangle like so. Let's find the legs of this triangle. This leg of the triangle is going to be x2 minus x1, because that's the distance between the x coordinates. This vertical leg of the triangle is going to be y2 minus y1, because that's the distance between the y coordinates. And let's just call this hypotenuse C for now. Let me step out of the way. And then now we just apply the Pythagorean theorem to find that distance C. So applying the Pythagorean theorem, we know that C squared has to be equal to the square root, or not the square root, not yet. It has to be equal to x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared, because we know a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And finally, we can just take the square root of both sides. And then we'll have that the side C, the hypotenuse, which is the distance between the 2 points, is simply equal to this formula below. So the distance formula is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. Let's now talk about how to get the midpoint formula. Let's talk about how to get the midpoint formula now. To get the midpoints between these 2 points, I'm just going to draw it roughly right there. Notice how the midpoint is halfway between those 2 points. That's the definition of a midpoint. But I want you to notice that it is halfway between the x coordinates and halfway between the y coordinates as well. So in other words, this distance, or these 2 distances, are the same, because halfway between the x coordinates, and these vertical distances have to be the same. So what this means is that to find the midpoint between 2 points, we can just take the average of the x coordinates and the y coordinates. To take the average, you just add up the 2 coordinates and then divide by 2. So for the x coordinate of the midpoint, you add up the x coordinates, x1 plus x2, and then you divide by 2. And then for the y coordinates, just simply add them up as well, y1 plus y2, and then divide by 2. So this is the midpoint formula for finding the midpoint between any 2 points. Let's try and use the midpoint formula and the distance formula in some problems now. Let's try this first problem now. It says, what is the midpoint of and the distance between the points minus 1, 3 and 9, 10? Let's do the midpoint first. So remember, the formula for the midpoint is just the average of the x coordinates and the y coordinates. So x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So let's just fill in some numbers and find the answer. x1 is minus 1. If I call this one x1 and y1, and call this one x2 and y2. So we have x1 plus x2, so minus 1 plus 9 divided by 2. And then for the y coordinate of the midpoint, we're going to have y1 is 3 and y2 is 10 divided by 2. So then minus 1 plus 9 is just 8. 3 plus 10 is 13. And then 8 divided by 2 is just 4. And then 13 divided by 2 is just 6.5. So this is the midpoint of those 2 points, 4, 6.5. Now let me erase all this and then let's get to the distance formula, so we can find the distance between these 2 points. So recall, the distance formula is just the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So let's just plug in some numbers. So x2 minus x1 is going to be 9 minus negative 1 squared, and then plus y2 minus y1 is just 10 minus 3. Then you have to square it. 9 minus negative 1 is just 10. 10 minus 3 is just 7. And then 10 squared is just 100. And y squared is just 49. Or 7 squared is just 49. So we just have the square root of 100 plus 49. And that, of course, is just the square root of 149. So that is the distance between our points. And if you put this into a calculator and you want the decimal form, this is roughly equal to 12.21. So that's how I find the distance between those 2 points. In this problem, we have the midpoint of minus 4 comma minus 6, and a comma b is 7 comma minus 10, and based on that, we need to find what a and b are. Let's first write out the midpoint formula. So we're going to have that x1 plus x2 over 2, and y1 plus y2 over 2 is the midpoint. Let me step out. And then why don't we just call this point x1 and y1, and call this one x2, then y2, or 2. So let's just fill in some numbers and see if that can help us solve for a and b. We're going to have that x1 plus x2 is minus 4 plus a divided by 2, comma, y1 plus y2 is minus 6 plus b divided by 2, and that's our midpoint, and this is equal to 7 comma minus 10. So based on that, I know that this whole thing, the minus 4 plus a over 2, is supposed to be equal to 7, and I know that minus 6 plus b over 2 has to be equal to minus 10. So I can now set up some equations to solve for a and b. Let's use the x-coordinates first. I first have minus 4 plus a over 2 is equal to 7. To solve, we'll just multiply both sides by 2 to eliminate the 2 in the denominator. If I do that, I'm going to have minus 4 plus a is equal to 7 times 2 is 14. And then solve for a, just add 4 to both sides. If you do that, you'll get that a is equal to 18. Now let's solve for b now. I'm going to use the y-coordinate equations to solve for b. We have minus 6 plus b divided by 2 is equal to minus 10. Once again, multiply by 2 on both sides. If you do that, you're going to get minus 6 plus b is equal to minus 10 times 2, which is negative 20. And simply add 6 to both sides. So therefore, b is just equal to negative 14. Let me just write those values up here again. So a equals 18, and b equals negative 14. So in other words, the midpoint of minus 4 comma minus 6 and 18 comma negative 14 is just 7 comma negative 10. Let's move on to problem 3. In problem 3, we have that the distance between the points 7 comma 1 and 9 comma y is 2 times the square root of 17. Find all values of y. So there might be more than one solution to this. Let's do this carefully. First, I'm going to write the distance formula. Remember, that's x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared is equal to the distance. Let's just call it c. So I'm just going to plug in numbers. So if I call this one x1, y1, and then x2, y2, I'll have that x2 minus x1 is 9 minus 7, square that, then plus y2 is just y, minus y1, which is just 1, squared is equal to 2 times the square root of 17, because that's our distance. To solve this equation for y, let's just square both sides. So if I square the left side here, the square and the square root cancel out, and I'll be left with 9 minus 7 squared plus y minus 1 squared is equal to 2 times square root of 17 squared. To simplify the right hand side, that's just equal to 2 squared times the square root of 17 squared, because the square root distributes to both of those terms. 2 squared is just 4, and then square root of 17 squared, is just equal to 17. So this is just 4 times 17, and 4 times 17 is just 68. Let's continue solving for y. I know that 9 minus 7 is just 2, and 2 squared is just 4. So this is just 4. Let's just subtract 4 from both sides. And if you do that, you'll get y minus 1 squared is equal to 64. Now take the square root of both sides again. That'll eliminate the square here and leave us with y minus 1. And the square root of 64 is, be careful now, is plus or minus 8. It could be either of those, so don't just restrict yourself to the positive solution here. And to solve for y, just add 1 to both sides. So I'm going to have y is equal to 1 plus or minus 8. So in other words, I just have to take both solutions now. Y equals 1 plus 8, and it also equals 1 minus 8. So 1 plus 8 is 9, and 1 minus 8 is negative 7. So we have two solutions for y. Y equals 9 or negative 7. So now let me go back to the points we just had at the start and show you what this means. Just going to erase all of this here. Oops. So we had 7, 1 as our first point, and we have 9, 9, that's one solution, and 9, negative 7 as another solution. And we know the distance between these points has to be the same. Let me just sketch this out and you can understand why that's the case. If I sketch these points, 7, 1 is roughly maybe over here. If that's a 7, that's 1. And then 9, 9 might be up here. So that's one distance. And we know this is equal to 2 times square root of 17. But notice that to have a distance of 2 times square root of 17 and have an x-coordinate of 9 for the second point, I can also go downwards as well. Like, can't I go this way as well? And that'll be the same distance. And this is how we got the point 9, negative 7. So that's why we had two solutions to this problem. Let's move on to the final problem of the day. In this final problem, we have that a diameter of the circle has the endpoints -1, 2, and 5, 6. Find the center and the radius of the circle. So first, let me plot these points really quick. -1, 2 is probably going to be right there. And then 5, 6 would just be right about here. So if this is a diameter of the circle like that, then the circle will probably look something like this. And I want you to notice that if we draw the center of the circle right there, notice how that's just the midpoint of these 2 points here. So to get the center, we're going to use the midpoint formula. And then if this is the radius, like that, I want you to notice that is half of this total length here. So in other words, to get the radius, we're going to apply the distance formula and then divide it by 2 to get the radius. So let's do that now. I'll start with the midpoint formula first. Remember, the midpoint between any 2 points is x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So let's just put in numbers to find the center of this circle. So for the x-coordinate of the center of the circle, we're going to have -1 plus 5 over 2. And for the y-coordinate of the center of the circle, we're going to have 2 plus 6 over 2. Well, -1 plus 5 is just 4, and 4 over 2 is just 2. And then 2 plus 6 is just 8, and 8 over 2 is just 4. So 2, 4 is the center of our circle. let's now work on getting the radius of this circle. To do that, we're going to need to apply the distance formula so I can find the total distance between those 2 points and then take half of that. So recall the distance formula is just x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So let's just put in numbers and solve. x2 minus x1 is going to be 5 minus negative 1, square that, and then y2 minus y1 is going to be 6 minus 2. Square that. And let's just compute this. 5 minus negative 1 is just 6, so I have 6 squared, and 6 minus 2 is just 4, so we have 4 squared. 6 squared is 36, and 4 squared is just 16. And then 36 plus 16 is just 52. So in other words, 52 is the distance between those points. But recall, for the radius, we need to take half of that. Because when we had the circle, let me just draw it again, and we had the distance between the 2 points on that diameter, we need to take half of that to get the radius. So this is our radius of the circle, square root of 52 over 2. And if we put that into a calculator, it's roughly 3.61. So that's the radius of our circle. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. Thanks for watching.